All right, everybody. I want to go through and do a different version of chapter 15. The current text took out how we test, which is going to be the basis of your exercise prescription project. So we need to go over differences. So what I did is I pared down the PowerPoint from the previous course edition. Keep in mind that book should be on reference in the library. I just want to kind of go through an overview of things so that you have them. We will go a bit more in depth in precautions and things that we measure in class when we go through chapter 16, but right now I just want to go through and get some things, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go. We need to look at how do we test for VO2 max. We can do a test that's considered to be a field test, and that is looking at your cardiorespiratory fitness. It is a way to test large numbers of people with very relatively low costs. So it might be a walk test or a run test or a stepping test, but it's something that's fairly easy. And like I said, doesn't actually require a ton of, I guess I don't want to say skill, but equipment. A big part of these tests, these field tests, are what your motivation is for doing them, and how really is your motivation? How well are you trying to do? So you may see in the military, they do field tests periodically just to kind of assess bare minimum standards. You will see some tests developed specifically for kids to use in schools, but it's a relatively easy, dirt cheap way of assessing a cardiovascular fitness. So we might look at a maximal run test. How far can you run in a set amount of time, or how fast you can run a set distance? So you might see the Cooper's 12-minute run or a 1.5 mile run for adults. They're pacer tests, and a 1 mile run walk that can be used for kids. How do they work? We talked about this. VO2 max estimates are based on that linear relationship between running speed and oxygen cost. So, you should be able to measure how you're doing. They're going to take 10 to 20 minutes to do. And we are going to have to get you to a running speed that is 90 to 95% of your VO2 max. By doing it for that 10 to 20 minutes, we're going to get rid of the anaerobic capacity and just really be able to focus on the aerobic. So here are some equations that you will need for your exercise prescription. So whether you're doing this running or whether you're looking at it from walking, this will give you what you need to plug in, okay? So if we look at these fitness classifications, we'll go over these more when we're in class, but just to give you an idea, when you pick up an ASCM, which is just a little textbook with, what are the recommendations, you're going to be able to pull this up, and based on your age and your gender, it will give you an overall where your VO2 max falls in. It's like we used to go when you were little and you go to the doctor, they would do age weight comparisons and where you sit in the, all 7-year-olds that are boys, it gives you an overall percentile of where you fit in. So pacers, they're used in schools. My kids were just complaining about them. Addison had to do it for high school, but it is looking at that 20-meter shuttle run. What's the speed? We're going to increase the speed at each level. As soon as you miss your beep, then the test is going to start to terminate. Again, motivation is going to be a huge component for this particular test when you put a bunch of kids together. But again, it's a way that you can at least, even if it's not super specific, right? Like if you can't get a great result, at least in a same repeat test on a kid, you can kind of see that they're improving, not improving. So pacers exist. The normative standards are out there. You know, my kids, I think Addison had hit 61 pacers to get an A in her gym class this time. So it really just depends on what's out there. So there are some standards that are set so that we have an idea of where we are. So when you guys do your exercise prescription, you're allowed to do one field test, and then you're going to do one more specific test. Okay, that way you can look at it, see if the results are super skewed, see if they're fairly comparable. If they're comparable, then why would you never just repeat with the easier test to complete, right? Those are all going to be components. A walk test, you can do a 1 mile walk, simple measurements. Here's the formula for it. You know, as you improve in fitness, your heart rate and or the time to complete will get lower. It may give you a higher estimated VO2 max than you truly have, but again, in easy comparisons, something you can look at. I would recommend that you do it at track. So now you've controlled for surface, and it's very easy to figure out where your 1 mile is. So I would encourage everyone, Britt is the only one to my knowledge that gets a pass for doing that today. Go and get this done. Just get that 1 mile test done. Google different ones online. You can do this field test. You could do the Cooper 12-minute test. But either way, get one done so that you have some amount of data collected, okay? There is a step test. That's a Canadian modified aerobic fitness test. If you put that in again to YouTube, you're gonna find some videos, but you're gonna be able to use this calculation to assess that ability. So again, when we start to look at these, there are standards that have been found over time. So this one just gives you a good idea of where you should start for that starting stage, and then what this translates into for oxygen costs. So again, if you Google them, you can kind of see how they are. I'm not sure if they didn't take them out of the book, just because there are so many that are out there and the criteria might be changing. But I'm not going to necessarily tell you that any are wrong. I just need you to have a good idea of what your options are, so that we have an idea. So we talked about field tests. Now we can look at graded tests. So we can use a treadmill, a cycle, a step bench. You're going to see changes in work rate every 2 to 3 minutes. So remember, since we changed the standard, we kind of have to re-hit that steady state, make sure we're working, and keep going. These generally are not going to take you to your maximum capacity. There'll be a predetermined endpoint for these tests. They can be maximal, but most of the time they're completed in a sub-max fashion. So what do we have to measure? We have to do heart rate. You can do that by palpation. You can put your hands on it, get your pulse, your wrist. You can do a stethoscope with the chest wall and count. You can be hooked up to fancier equipment. And an ECG will display your heart rate the whole time on our monitor. I mean, our phones, our Garmin watches, all of them at this point, we have a lot more tech options to keep track of that. We're going to look at it during exercise. We might look at it in recovery. If we're doing it based on a recovery heart rate, it should be for 10 seconds within the first 15 seconds of stopping exercise, because you'll see that heart rate fall back really fairly quickly. Blood pressure, we talked a little bit about how you measure that. If you're trying to measure blood pressure, you can't fixate the arm and maintain grip. So if you're on a treadmill, you can't be holding onto that handlebar. Our ECG measures double product, which is the workload of the heart, which is heart rate times systolic BP, right? So we're looking for arrhythmias. So, you're going to see somebody on an ECG whenever we're assessing fitness, but we have a medical compromise. So those are usually going to be done with cardiac pulmonary specialist around. Personally, I would want to know if there's a doctor around, because if I give you an MI testing you, I really don't, want to be the only one responsible for that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ischemia and different things that can show up later in the course, but you can have a symptom of ischemia, which is chest pain, it's that angina, or you can see a sign of ischemia, which will be like that ST segment depressed on the ECG. So just keep in mind, both of them will be there. We'll talk a little bit about RPE later, but there was an original scale, 6 to 20, and a revised scale of 0 to 10, where we are looking at what your effort is, okay? So you can look at that while you're going through a graded test to assess progress. The big thing about it is you are supposed to pay attention to how hard they feel like the exercise work rate is, not I have a pain in my big toe. My left calf feels tight. You can't look at it as those specific things. So you're going to tell the patient or the client to look at the scale. This is a rating relating to your overall exertion, not a particular body part. So effort, not strain, discomfort, and fatigue of a single body part. So that way you can really make sure that they're understanding. When we look at this, I understand that the revised is the 0 to 10. The original was that 6 to 20. I've given both to patients and they do better with the 6 to 20. So I generally will use the original RPE scale because I feel like that gives them more options. So a test question would be, what is the original RPE scale? It's the revised. Know the differences. Why would you stop it? Well, it's a lot depending on what you're doing. What's the purpose of your test? What's the population being tested? Are you testing somebody who's medically fragile and they tell you, I can't do this? Listen, okay? If you're testing a bunch of kids who are whiny and don't want to do it, maybe that's a different story. So for a non-diagnostic graded exercise test, there are guidelines to stop testing. So these feel like very reasonable things to know. If they have chest pain, stop the test. If we have a drop in systolic blood pressure, even though we're working harder, that's not the way it's supposed to go. So I would stop the test. If we see a huge rise in blood pressure over 250, over 115, absolutely stop. If they're short of breath, if they're wheezing, if they're complaining that their legs are cramping, stop the test. If they appear to be confused or nauseous or lightheaded, they're clearly not getting oxygen to their brain. Stop the test. If we keep working harder and harder and harder and their heart rate is failing to change, stop the test. If you have them up on an ECG and you start to see their heart rhythms going all over the place, stop the test. If they say, I need to stop, if they look terrible, stop the test. If your treadmill is making all sorts of noises and the belt is skipping and it is failing, stop the test. I would know why we would choose to stop the test. So I would put a big fat star on this slide because this to me feels like if you don't listen to these things, we can kill people, okay? So just recognize we're gonna have to look at different things during these tests. We know our VO2 max is the gold standard for cardiorespiratory fitness. We have found that over time, it is very reproducible on the same work instruments. We're best on the treadmill. Running is going to be better than walking. We're definitely going to be better than doing a bike. And a bike measuring legs is far superior than an arm bike, okay? We can get a VO2 max versus a VO2 peak. If we think we've met VO2 max, we're gonna see that as that work rate goes up, that VO2 just levels. If we were somewhere with lots of equipment, we could do blood tests. And as soon as we see blood lactate levels increase over 8 millimoles, we know we're there. If R is over 1.15, we're there. Again, we don't have fancy equipment to start to measure those things. If we're starting to get to heart rate within 10 beats of that age predicted maximal heart rate, we're going to start to think we've achieved our VO2 max. I'm going to tell you that usefulness has definitely been questioned. Age adjusted heart rate max is going to be plus or minus 11 beats, which still feels like a fair amount of variability. And certainly in a medical situation, that may also impact it quite a bit. We're never going to think we're going to hit all of the things and all of the lights are going to go off and you have achieved VO2 max. Remember, as we plot these things, we're going to be able to estimate, and that's what's important here. So we don't have the equipment to directly measure it. So we're going to come with these graded exercise tests, be able to extrapolate measures, and have a really fairly good estimation, and certainly one that we can repeat. We have to hit steady state at each stage of this so that we know we've settled into what we've got. There's lots of different equations. If we're looking at a maximal test, we're going to be a standard deviation of like 3 milliliters per kilogram. If we're looking at a heart rate in a submax test, we're going to be closer to a 4 to 5 milliliter per kilogram per minute difference. And if we're looking at just like an estimated walk or a 12-minute run, we're going to see almost a 5 milliliter difference. So that standard error is going to be there. We just have to know and accept that it's an estimate. So if we're looking at our heart rate response, we're going to get up to 70 to 85% of our predicted max heart rate. We're going to be able to extrapolate that heart rate to VO2 max. Keep in mind, things can affect it. We can be dehydrated. It can be hot. We could be on a medicine. All of those things will help us figure it out. But this is what we're looking at. So, we start plotting at work rates. You can see that along the bottom. And we're going to start to plug in what our heart rate is at each one of those. And at a certain point, we hit 85% of your max heart rate. Now we're just going to draw a line up until we get to that age-related 200, and then drop it down to give us that estimated VO2 max, okay? And that's what you're going to do for me. You're going to do one field test and calculate your VO2, and then you're going to do one graded exercise test, and you're going to calculate VO2. And that's going to give you one, are they greatly different between the two? If so, give me some reasons why you think that's the actual answer. Or you're going to see that they line up fairly well, and that's going to give us a good idea of where we need to be. There's tons of protocols. You have to choose a submax versus a maximal test. You have to figure out where your starting work rate is. Some of that will be specific to the test. All right, let's call out here, Abe runs cross country. My guess is he's going to have some cardiovascular fitness, right? If he starts with a walk test or a really easy protocol, he'll never see the heart rate response he needs to measure, okay? So if you're a runner in fairly good shape, you're going to probably choose a running test, okay? So maybe my basketball players don't choose a treadmill test because they can run, but they don't really want to run. Maybe they choose a more advanced step test. So keep in mind, you're going to look at what you do, look at what you need to do, and then make a comparison from there, what you want to do, okay? So choose where you are. If you're a runner, start with I'm a relatively fit individual and don't start with a walk test, okay? So some of the treadmills used to have a problem doing these because they couldn't hit the incline that you needed. So again, depending on your level of fitness, you may have to finesse some of these. So check the treadmills in Decker and over at Kelchner and see what you can do. They used to have downstairs some cycles that we could look at, but if you look at this for very fit subjects, you need to be able to hit an incline of 12.5 on the treadmill, conceivably. So just keep in mind, there are lots of different tests for the treadmill to see what it is we're really looking for and what we need to do, okay? So you can have them where they're looking at force fit subjects with heart disease. It can be standard for normal sitting individuals. We can be active, but we can also be very, very fit. So you're going to have to kind of guess where you are. And maybe you have to do one or two of these. But you can see where your speed stays constant and we just start changing the grade of the treadmill. So again, you know, this active fit boost protocol, it's up to an 18% grade. So again, those are going to be things you can't do. You're going to find in the links, there's one that says a boost protocol for treadmill. It walks you through it. Watch the video. I particularly cared about the music and the hair and that one, but it will give you a good idea of how practically it looks. So here's how we do some of the calculations, depending on what test you choose. You can see along the bottom, it's going to be the grade change. That's going to be correlated to some different METs. We're going to measure heart rate. So we can kind of start to see where we are. We'll stop when you hit your 85% of max heart rate, and then extrapolate up. Some people are really fancy and they can make these little graphs and everything on the computer. I don't care, get out a ruler and draw it in for me, because you will hand me your exercise prescription project when it's time, okay? So you feel free to draw these out, but that's how you're gonna do your calculations and figure out what your VO2 max is. Cycles. So we talked a little bit about the bike being an option. If they can't walk, if there's an orthopedic reason why, they're not going to hold up for that, biking is it. If you're doing something where you are a cycler, maybe you just want to check your VO2 on the instrument you know, which is going to be cycling. So you're working at resistance and pedal rate. Generally speaking, you're going to maintain that pedal rate and change the resistance. So again, there's a single stage 6-minute test. There's a YMCA protocol. There's lots of different choices. So if we look at this YMCA, and I believe this was the second link I put on with a video for you, you're going to look at that resting heart rate. You know, if everybody starts the same way, right, for stage 1, if our heart rate is low, we're going to go straight to an increase in resistance, right? Pretty much double that if your heart rate was over 100, okay? So that way we really, if you're fit and this is going to be an easier test for you, you can load the system a little bit faster, so you're not there quite as long. But you will just look at the criteria for the next stage and then move on to that. So again, same thing. We are going to look at this heart rate, and when we have hit more than 110 beats per minute, twice, we're going to be able to extrapolate up our line, figure out exactly where we are. Okay. A step test, you know, there's different protocols. We're going to look at what the step rate is and the step height. So we're going to look at that heart rate and be able to extrapolate based on that, what that estimated VO2 max is. I use a version of STEP test in my office to look at cardiovascular fitness for some of the pre-employment screens I do for work. Okay, so if you're looking at a step rate that needs to be maintained, you can just open up a metronome app, set in what the parameters are, and you just have to step according to beat. So again, if we look at this, there'll be different estimations that we can make. We can plug those in, and that'll get us our VO2 max, right? So I need you this weekend, again, exceptions only going to be Britland, simply because she's not walking right now. I need you to do a field test. Either choose a walk test or a run test, but figure out the heart rate, figure out how you did, bring those things to class, look at the equations at the beginning of this PowerPoint, and see if you can't get an estimate of where you stand for VO2. All right, just based on the field test. So that gave us an idea of kind of where we are right now. I want you to probably by the day that we go into Decker to do your 1 rep maxes, I want you to have a fairly good idea what your graded test is going to be, whether you're going to choose to do a cycle, a step, or a treadmill test. And I want you to start to figure out what you need to be able to accomplish that. Okay, seems like a very reasonable place to start. If you have any questions, email me. But let's start there and see where we're at. Okay, don't judge me either. It's a Sunday and I'm doing stuff around my house, but I need my kid to bounce this to YouTube before she goes back to school. So hence, I didn't get dressed. Anyway, I'll see you guys in class on Monday and we'll go from there. Thanks.